Philosophy, that grand old pursuit of wisdom, isn't one happy, unified family. Oh no. If you were to wander into a university philosophy department in, say, 1975, you might have noticed a rather peculiar and sometimes frosty divide. It was as if two different species of thinker were coexisting, barely acknowledging one another. This was the great schism between what we call Analytic and Continental philosophy. This wasn't just a disagreement over a few minor points. It was a fundamental split in how to do philosophy itself. It shaped departments, determined careers, and created a chasm that, for much of the 20th century, seemed utterly unbridgeable. It was a proper intellectual Cold War, fought not with spies but with syllogisms and sweeping critiques of existence. The roots of this great divide, like so many things in modern thought, can be traced back to the towering figure of Immanuel Kant. After Kant, philosophers had to decide how to proceed with his monumental work. Two distinct paths emerged. In the German-speaking world, thinkers like Hegel, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche took philosophy on a journey into history, culture, and the lived human experience. This path would eventually lead to what we now call Continental philosophy, a name derived simply from its origins on the European continent. Meanwhile, in Britain and America, a different group of thinkers inspired by advances in science and mathematics decided that philosophy needed a good, clean sweep. They sought precision, clarity, and logical rigor above all else. This divergence wasn't merely geographical, it was profoundly methodological. The analytic tradition, championed by figures like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, believed philosophy's main job was to solve problems by analyzing them into their smallest logical parts. They looked at language with a magnifying glass, suspecting that many of philosophy's oldest puzzles were just linguistic muddles. If we could only get our words straight, they argued, we could achieve real clarity. It was a philosophy that saw itself as a partner to science, a kind of conceptual janitor tidying up the messy language that scientists and the rest of us leave lying about. On the other side of the English Channel, the Continental tradition was having none of this. For thinkers in this camp, philosophy wasn't about solving small puzzles. It was about grappling with the big, messy, often uncomfortable questions of human existence. What does it mean to be? How does history shape our consciousness? How do power structures influence our lives? They were less interested in the logical structure of a sentence and more interested in the context, the history, and the lived reality behind it. This tradition embraced ambiguity and the richness of human experience, often using a literary or historical style that their analytic cousins found frustratingly imprecise and, well, a bit woolly. Analytic philosophy, at its heart, is a quest for clarity. Its pioneers were rather fed up with the grand, sprawling systems of 19th-century German idealism. They felt philosophy had become too vague, too pretentious, and too disconnected from reality. Bertrand Russell, one of its brightest stars, sought to rebuild philosophy on the firm foundations of logic. He believed that by using the tools of formal logic, we could dissect complex statements and reveal their true structure, separating sense from nonsense. This movement, often called logical positivism in its more extreme early form, insisted that a statement was only meaningful if it was either a matter of logic or could be verified by empirical evidence. Everything else, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, was deemed, rather bluntly, to be meaningless. The key figures in this tradition read like a who's who of rigorous minds. Alongside Russell, there was his Cambridge colleague G.E. Moore, who championed common sense, and the enigmatic Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose work profoundly shaped the tradition in two distinct phases. Later, thinkers like W.V.O. Quine in America challenged some of the movement's early dogmas, but continued its focus on language and logic. Analytic philosophers typically focus on specific, well-defined problems. Media group, philosophy student pondering over problem in library, scholar writing notes under heading epistemology, stock who distribute equally. The nature of knowledge, the meaning of a word, the structure of a scientific explanation, or the ethics of a particular action. They write in a style that is deliberately plain, precise, and argumentative, building their case step by step like a mathematical proof. Imagine an analytic philosopher tackling the question, what is truth? They wouldn't write a sweeping historical account of the concept. Instead, they might start by analyzing the sentence structure of "snow is white" is true. They would break it down, examining the relationship between the words, the sentence, and the state of the world. This is the essence of their method, breaking big, confusing questions into smaller, manageable, logical components. Their ideal is the clarity of science, and their greatest fear is the obscurity of mystics and poets. They prefer a small, well-polished truth to a grand, ambiguous one, believing that progress is made through careful, incremental steps. This approach had a colossal impact on universities, especially in the English-speaking world. Philosophy departments in the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia became strongholds of the analytic tradition. Students were trained to construct tight arguments, spot logical fallacies, and write with exacting precision. The curriculum focused on media group, open logic textbook, professor writing logical symbols on blackboard @at stock, @distribute _equally, logic, epistemology, the theory of knowledge, philosophy of language, and metaphysics approached in a highly analytical way. For students, this meant a rigorous, almost scientific training. The downside was that it often shut out the other great stream of thought flowing from the continent, treating it as something not quite serious. Or worse, not philosophy at all. While the analytics were busy polishing their logical tools, Continental philosophy was embarking on a very different kind of adventure. This tradition is less a single method and more a family of related movements, united by a common set of concerns. It includes phenomenology, existentialism, hermeneutics, structuralism, and post-structuralism. What binds them is a focus on human experience as it is lived, from the inside out. They argue that you cannot understand consciousness, freedom, or society by standing outside them like a neutral scientific observer. You must dive into the messy, subjective, and often contradictory flow of life itself to make sense of it. The leading lights of continental thought created philosophies that were deeply intertwined with culture, politics, and the arts. Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology, urged a return to the things themselves, meaning a careful description of conscious experience. Martin Heidegger took this further, asking the monumental question of what it means to be. Then came the existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who explored the anxiety and freedom of creating meaning in a meaningless universe. Later, figures like Michel Foucault examined how power and knowledge shape our very identities, while Jacques Derrida questioned the stability of language and meaning through deconstruction. Continental philosophers are fascinated by themes that their analytic counterparts often found too slippery to handle. They explore subjectivity, history, power, alienation, and embodiment. They don't ask what is justice. In the abstract, they ask how our concept of justice has been shaped by historical forces and power structures. They are interested in how our being in the world, our physical, social, and historical situation, determines how we think and what we can know. Their writing style reflects this, often being more literary, evocative, and historical. They see philosophy not as a problem-solving toolkit, but as a practice of diagnosis and interpretation, a way of understanding our cultural condition. The method, if one can call it that, is interpretive and critical. A continental thinker might approach a text not to analyze its logical validity, but to uncover its hidden assumptions and historical context, a method known as hermeneutics. They might look at a social practice not to define its rules, but to reveal the unspoken power dynamics at play. For them, philosophy is inseparable from history and society. This approach dominated universities in France, Germany, and much of the rest of Europe. Students were encouraged to read widely across disciplines, literature, history, psychoanalysis, and to see philosophy as an act of cultural critique. The result was a deep engagement with society, but one that analytics often criticized for lacking rigor and clarity. For decades, the analytic continental divide was less a respectful disagreement and more of a trench war. Departments became ideologically entrenched, hiring only their own and often dismissing the other side with a dismissive wave. Analytic philosophers accused the Continentals of being obscure, irrational, and writing little more than bad poetry. Continental philosophers in turn saw the Analytics as sterile, uninspired technicians who were blind to the big questions of life, fiddling with linguistic puzzles while the world burned. This academic tribalism meant that generations of students were often educated in one tradition to the complete exclusion of the other, creating a cycle of mutual ignorance and suspicion. However, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the ice began to thaw. Philosophers on both sides started to realize they might have something to learn from one another. Some analytic philosophers grew tired of the narrowness of their field and began to engage with figures like Heidegger and Foucault. American thinkers like Richard Rorty built bridges, using tools from both traditions to question the very foundations of philosophy itself. Similarly, some thinkers trained in the Continental tradition began to see the value of analytic clarity and argumentation, seeking to express their ideas with greater precision. The old geographical lines also blurred as ideas traveled more freely in an increasingly globalized academy. This move towards reconciliation has produced some wonderfully fruitful work. We now have analytic feminists who use logical tools to dissect arguments about gender while also drawing on continental critiques of power. Philosophers of mind are engaging with phenomenology to better understand the nature of consciousness, realizing that first-person experience cannot be ignored. Ethicists are blending analytic rigor with continental insights into history and culture to tackle complex moral problems. The strict separation is breaking down, not into a single grey mush, but into a more diverse and pluralistic landscape, where thinkers can pick and choose the best tools for the job at hand, regardless of their origin. So why does this old quarrel still matter? It matters because it reminds us that philosophy can be done in profoundly different ways. The split highlights a fundamental tension between the pursuit of objective, timeless truth and the interpretation of subjective, historical meaning. Understanding both sides protects us from the dogmatic belief that there is only one right way to think. By appreciating the analytic drive for clarity and the continental concern for context, we gain a fuller picture of what philosophy can be. It is not about choosing a side, but about seeing the whole field. True philosophical wisdom perhaps lies not in the trenches of one camp, but in the ability to travel freely across the entire, wonderfully varied landscape of human thought.